If you went along to Dominic Raab's presentation today, you might be left thinking that no deal really wouldn't be that much of a problem. The government can cope with it. But not long after the presentation came two big government announcements which suggest that no deal could be a very big problem indeed. First, the Chancellor chose today of all days to announce that no deal would have large fiscal consequences. And he revealed there is Treasury research going on which is likely to suggest that the consequences of no deal could be even worse than he suggested in the last analysis in January. Second, the Health Secretary told the pharmaceutical industry it should stockpile another 6 weeks of drugs to cope with possible disruption from Europe.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming.
Don't worry was the message the Brexit Secretary tried to give us. We don't expect no deal, Dominic Raab said, but if it happens, we're prepared and there's no need to panic, he implied.
But let me be clear about this. It is not what we want and it's not what we expect. But we must be ready. We have a duty as a responsible government to plan for every eventuality.
Mr Raab, a Brexiteer, insisted he doesn't want no deal, but he did list some benefits.
The immediate recovery of full legislative and regulatory control, including over immigration policy. The unfettered ability to lower tariffs to bring into effect new free trade deals that we negotiate straight away. And mindful of our strict legal obligations, a swifter end to our financial contributions to the EU.
But Mr Raab's big day was rather spoilt by the Chancellor announcing he expects new Treasury research to show no deal would do even more harm to the economy than he previously thought. Philip Hammond wrote to the chair of the Commons Treasury Committee, telling her the Treasury is refining its January analysis, which suggested government borrowing would be £80 billion higher in 15 years' time. Now the effects are likely to be worse, Mr Hammond said. We expect the analysis to show that for scenarios in which we would have higher barriers to trade with the EU, there will be a more damaging effect on the economy and public finances. Dominic Raab's papers on no deal today confirm extra red tape and higher costs for businesses trading with the EU. And the public should expect higher charges on card payments within the European Union. The pharmaceutical industry has long warned medicine supplies would be at severe risk under no deal. But Mr Raab's papers today left them reassured.
This is a good day for patients. Patients can feel confident that the government and the industry are working well together to put plans in place to make sure that we can continue to supply their medicines to them.
Strangely, Mr Raab's documents fail to say that ministers now want the pharma industry to stockpile a lot more medicines. That news only came later when the Health Secretary Matt Hancock wrote to pharmaceutical firms warning no deal might disrupt EU imports and they should acquire another 6 weeks' supplies, largely at their expense. As for stockpiling food, that's just a scare story, Dominic Raab said. But the industry thinks no deal would still mean disruption.
Real concern that we have and our members have is how can all that has to be done in the time available. Things like registering as approved economic operators, understanding the new customs system, all of that stuff is really difficult. And we've only got 6 months to do it, and we haven't even been told yet how these systems will work. So time is against us, we need information, and we're running out of the time in order to put it into effect.
I thought the proposals were bland, thin on detail, thin on substance, and I don't think they're going to reassure anybody. This appears to me to be a government in denial about the serious consequences of no deal.
Today was just the government's first batch of no deal advisory papers.
Thank you very much.
They'll release another 60 next month.
And Michael, what's this about some prominent UKIPers joining the Tory party?
Yes, Aaron Banks, one of UKIP's biggest funders, and his sidekick Andy Wigmore have both announced today that they've joined the Conservative Party. Now, this will stoke the fears of those in the party who are saying that the party is susceptible to infiltration from thousands of UKIP members, perhaps people with the intention of getting somebody like Boris Johnson elected as the next Conservative leader. Now, there are reports tonight that the Conservatives have actually blocked their applications, but Banks and Wigmore say that they've had a very nice letter saying that their membership has been activated. So another problem for Theresa May.
Michael, thanks very much. Fatima.
Thanks, Matt. Well, our business correspondent Helia Ibrahimi has been going through the government's 25 documents to find out what impact their plans could have for British industry, especially sectors like financial services. She takes a look at the doomsday scenario.
The City of London is a ghost town. The realities of Brexit are starting to sink in. Without a deal, many UK financial services will no longer be legal in Europe. People, licences and regulatory capital will have to leave. $26 trillion of financial contracts could be marked invalid. And for consumers, tens of millions of insurance contracts and pension plans could fail to pay out. While today the government said it would pretty much unilaterally grant European firms business as usual extensions in the case of a no-deal Brexit, no such assurance has been offered by the EU. That leaves all EU residents, whether European or British, with huge problems when it comes to cashing in insurance policies or their savings. Without agreement from EU regulators, pensioners are one group at risk.
Whether you're UK or an EU citizen, if you're receiving a payment from the UK into the EU through a pension contract, there's uncertainty over the legality of that. And we need that uncertainty removed so insurers don't have to face choosing between breaking their promise and breaking the law.
This is the paradox of choice facing consumers and companies as the prospect of a no-deal Brexit becomes ever more real.
Well, Helia is with me now. Who does it all affect?
Well, it's the whole financial plumbing that underpins the day-to-day lives of companies, of households, that has a giant no-deal spanner in it. Now, today the UK government tried to alleviate some of that, granting European companies extensions. So, for example, Fatima, if you had a home insurance policy with Allianz and you had a fire, under the rules created by the government today, you could cash in that policy, no problems. The issues arise if you're an European resident and you're trying to access a UK product, whether that's an annuity or an insurance product. By next March, that could be illegal. And to give you some context, there could be as many as 38 million insurance products alone like that.
Is it just insurance?
No, it's the whole gamut of financial services, from the very large to the very small. But just to pick out one more consumer issue highlighted by today's report, it's credit cards. Now, in a no-deal scenario, we won't be protected by something called the surcharging ban. So transactions that UK credit cards have in the continent could become more expensive, whether by pennies or by pounds. It illustrates the kind of problems that we might see. Now, before anyone accuses me of scaremongering, it's worth saying that within the city and even within Treasury, there's a belief that in the 11th hour an arrangement will be found, whether that's a no-deal deal that will help alleviate some of these issues for the consumers. But in the end, it needs political will in Europe to make that happen.
Helia, thanks very much. Matt.
Thanks, Fatima. Well, joining me now are Ali Renison, who's head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors, Neil Dixon, Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation and co-chair of the Brexit Health Alliance, and Martin Howe, QC from Lawyers for Britain. Welcome to all of you for coming on the programme. We've got a lot to rattle through, so let's start rattling. Neil Dixon, over to you first. Can you reassure a potential patient that if there is a no-deal Brexit, or rather, are you reassured that that patient will get the same treatment in a year's time as he would do today?
Well, I think we can be a little more assured than we were yesterday, because it is clear that the government is starting to take this seriously. It's recognised that it's all very well to hope for the best, but you've got to start planning for the worst. And that, in a sense, is what the first step has involved today. And the decision, for example, to ask pharmaceutical companies to plan were 6 months of stockpiling, to ask also that where drugs are perishable or they've got short shelf lives, that they should arrange air freight. Because the first problem that is going to face us with a no-deal Brexit is around the borders and passing through those borders in the days and weeks after that decision. So I think it is right. The government is taking some steps. In answer to your question, am I totally reassured? I think the answer is not at this stage, though I don't think there is any reason for patients to panic or get anxious at this moment. I think in time this will be sorted, but the government is starting quite late in the day, and I think doing some of this stuff in the time that we've got will be a challenge.
But briefly, things like insulin, for instance, there were quite a few stories about that. There won't be enough insulin for people who suffer from diabetes. Are you reassured on that front, for instance?
Well, I think that what the government has done is identify every single medicine where we are dependent to some degree or other on imports from Europe, and has looked into the vulnerabilities in each area, is talking to the manufacturers about making sure that there are the right levels of stockpiling. I mean, that is exactly what should have happened and is now happening. So to that extent, I think we can be reassured. But of course, some of the detail still needs to be followed up. And I think our members in hospitals, for example, all around the country, they want some more operational detail, I think, to support them, because although they're very used to dealing with emergencies, this is a really challenging and difficult and unprecedented set of circumstances.
Okay. Ali Renison, are you reassured? You represent companies, the Institute of Directors. Has enough been said to you to reassure you?
Well, it is a belated first step. It would have been helpful to have this much earlier on in the game, because I think what it in some ways sends a message, even if indirectly, to a lot of businesses, is that it's being put out this late because no deal looks imminent. And I think if it had been done earlier, that would have been avoided. Having said that, it's certainly a welcome, if belated, first step. And the big question will be what's coming in the next set of tranches, because there's quite a bit missing, whether it was on citizens' rights, enforcement of other related contracts. So all eyes will be on the next tranche, very much so.
But quite a bit missing could also be really quite existential for quite a few businesses, couldn't it?
Yeah, and I think that, there were three things we were looking for from today. One was information about how rules would change, and I think the government did a very good job of that, explaining how trade currently flows with the EU and how it would change once third country rules are applied. Secondly, what steps business should be taking now. And thirdly, what unilateral action it would take to mitigate the impact of no deal. And I think what we are still looking for, there was a lot of information on the pharmaceutical front, but when it comes to particularly the areas that the government can control on imports, we would have liked to have seen around VAT and customs within the constraints of international trade rules, what more mitigating action the government would be taking under a no-deal scenario to reduce the impact.
Martin, now let's turn to you. You've written a long article where you said actually we should embrace no deal because we'd be better off in a no-deal Brexit than under the Chequers proposal. Tell us about oranges.
OK. Well, at the moment, oranges face a 16% tariff when they're imported from outside the European Union. And this is a symptom of the structure of tariffs that has really existed ever since we first joined the common market in 1972. Basically, there are very high tariffs on areas that protect continental farming interests, German manufacturers, the Italian clothing industry. All these are areas of high tariffs. Now, the effect of having a high tariff on, in this case, the example is oranges, is, of course, that we pay above the world price, that is, British consumers pay above the world price for oranges, and if we import competing oranges from Florida or wherever, they have to pay the tariff.
Right.
So one of the things that we can do when we leave is immediately get rid of tariffs on goods where we have no domestic growers or producers.
Okay.
Oranges is an example.
So we might be able to buy cheaper oranges, but what about exporting to the European Union? And what about credit card transactions, VAT on parcels, pensions not being guaranteed in the way that they are right now? This is pretty big stuff, bigger than oranges, arguably.
Well, oranges, of course, is just one tiny example. Actually, the effect is pretty vast. Because if we pursue a sensible tariff policy, we would be able to cut the costs of our imports on goods across the board by a very considerable level. And you're looking at savings in the many billions of pounds a year for British consumers. Now, you asked about exports into the EU. Of course, that's the opposite direction. The European Union would naturally, in fact, it's required by WTO rules to impose the same tariffs on imports from the UK as it does from the rest of the world.
Right.
But studies have been done on how much that would be, and it's around 5 billion a year, which our exporters pay. It's under half our current net budget contribution, so it's not a big deal.
All right, just one on the brief one to you. The Chancellor's prediction were pretty dire today, even worse than his previous predictions. 80 billion extra pounds in borrowing, a stagnant economy for 15 years. Do you dismiss those proclamations?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I mean I don't necessarily want to get into the economic debate. But what I would say is the Treasury has consistently produced a series of studies which have purported to demonstrate it's all a disaster if we leave. This is more of the same pattern. And interestingly, one of the problems was they fed in an assumption in their original studies, which was that we would gratuitously impose huge import tariffs, which we don't need to do.
All right. I'm afraid the clock really is against us. So much more to discuss, no time to do it. Ali Renison, Neil Dixon, and Martin Howe, thank you very much indeed.